They say karma works in mysterious ways, but sometimes it works fast. One moment you're on top of the world, making rules, controlling lives. The next, you're watching your entire world go up in flames. Literally. This is the story of Karen, an HOA president drunk on power, who made the biggest mistake of her life. She thought she could bend the rules in her favor, that she was untouchable. But karma had other plans, because the very rules she enforced would soon come back to burn her, along with everything she owned. Welcome to Maplewood Estates, a quiet, picturesque neighborhood where the houses are big, the lawns are perfect, and the HOA rules are even bigger. And at the center of it all, Karen, a woman who didn't just enforce the HOA rules. She lived for them. You know the type, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, the kind of person who'd fine you $50 for having the wrong shade of flowers in your garden, who'd send passive-aggressive letters if your trash bins were out for too long, the kind of HOA dictator who believed that rules mattered more than people. And the neighborhood? They hated her, but no one ever dared to challenge her, because Karen had power, and she knew exactly how to use it. Until one night, when a house in the neighborhood caught fire. A devastating, raging fire, the kind that consumes everything in its path. The kind that doesn't care about HOA rules. The fire trucks rushed in, sirens blaring, red lights flashing. Time was everything. Every second counted. But then, just as the trucks reached the neighborhood, they hit a problem. Karen, standing there in her silk robe and slippers, arms crossed, blocking the entrance. Why? Because, according to her HOA rules, emergency vehicles needed prior approval to enter private roads. Let that sink in. A house was burning to the ground, and Karen? She was more worried about rules than saving lives. What she didn't know, she had just sealed her own fate. Because in just a few weeks, karma would come knocking, and this time the fire would be at her doorstep. If you've ever lived in a neighborhood with an HOA, you already know, there's always that one person who takes things too far. The self-proclaimed ruler, the enforcer of ridiculous rules, the person who treats a suburban street like their personal kingdom. And in Maplewood Estates, that person was Karen. She wasn't just an HOA president. She was a dictator. No detail was too small for her to control. If your grass was half an inch too tall, fine. If your car was parked in your driveway for more than 2 hours, violation notice. If you put up holiday decorations too early or too late, expect a letter. She once fined an elderly couple $200 because their mailbox was faded from the sun. She made a single mom repaint her house twice because she didn't like the shade of beige. And the worst part? She loved every second of it. She patrolled the neighborhood like a queen inspecting her kingdom, holding her little clipboard, writing people up, smiling like she was doing the world a favor. She thrived on power until the night of the fire. But before we get to her biggest mistake, let's talk about one of her biggest enemies. A man named Jake. Jake had lived in Maplewood Estates for years. A hardworking guy, kept to himself, paid his dues. But he was also one of the few people who dared to push back against Karen's nonsense. One time, she tried to fine him for having an unauthorized vehicle in his driveway. It was his brother's car, who was visiting for the weekend. He fought back, won, and Karen hated him for it. Another time, she tried to ban kids from playing with chalk on the sidewalks. Jake started a petition to overturn it, and succeeded. So, when Jake's house caught fire that night, and the firefighters rushed in to save his home, Karen saw it as her chance for revenge. She marched out of her house, stood right in front of the fire trucks, and blocked them from entering the street. She had the HOA rulebook in her hand, and with zero emotion, she told the firefighters, "This is private property. You need HOA approval to enter." Time was ticking. Flames were rising. But Karen, she didn't care. Jake's house burned to the ground that night. And Karen, she slept just fine. What she didn't know was that karma was already on its way. Because in just a few weeks, fire trucks would be rushing down this same street. But this time, the house on fire would be hers. Karma doesn't always come instantly, but when it does, It makes sure you feel every second of it. It had been 2 weeks since Karen blocked the fire trucks from saving Jake's house. 2 weeks since she watched his home turn into a pile of ashes, without a shred of remorse. Jake had lost everything. His clothes, his childhood photos, his late father's belongings, all gone. And Karen? She went about her life like nothing happened. She still patrolled the neighborhood. Still handed out petty fines for mailbox height violations. Still acted like she was untouchable. But karma was patient. And one night, just past midnight, it struck. It started in the garage. No one knows exactly how, but one thing was clear: flames were spreading fast. Within minutes, the fire had climbed up the walls, reaching the second floor. Karen woke up to the sound of shattering glass and the piercing screech of her smoke alarm. She ran to the window, and that's when she saw it. Her house was on fire. Panic set in. She screamed. She grabbed her phone. And with shaking hands, she did the one thing she never thought she'd have to do. She called 911. The fire trucks arrived just minutes later. Sirens blaring. Lights flashing. Just like the night of Jake's fire. But this time something was different. Because when the fire trucks tried to enter, they stopped. They paused at the entrance to the neighborhood. And for the first time, Karen felt something she had never felt before. Helpless. She ran outside, waving her arms, screaming at them. "What are you doing? My house is burning." And then, the fire chief stepped out. The same fire chief from 2 weeks ago. The same man who had begged Karen to let them through that night. And with a cold, emotionless stare, he said, "Sorry, ma'am. We need HOA approval to enter." Karen's world collapsed in that moment. She watched in horror as her own rules were used against her. The fire chief pulled out a clipboard, the same way she had done to her neighbors countless times, and began filling out paperwork. Following the HOA guidelines. One by one, firefighters slowly checked every box. Is there a permit for emergency vehicle access? Nope. Has the HOA issued an emergency clearance? Negative. Are the fire trucks parked in an unauthorized zone? Technically, yes. The minutes ticked by. Karen screamed, begged, pleaded. But the fire department, they followed the rules, just like she had taught them. By the time the paperwork was finally complete, the fire had consumed most of the house. Neighbors gathered outside, watching in silence. Some recorded on their phones. Some whispered to each other. And Jake? He just stood there, arms crossed, watching as Karen lost everything, just like she had let happen to him. Watching as karma burned her kingdom to the ground. Karen stood there, frozen. Her house, her precious, rule-perfect house, was now a towering inferno. The flames danced across the roof, thick black smoke billowed into the night sky, and the heat was unbearable. She looked around, searching for sympathy. But there was none. The neighbors? The same people she had terrorized for years? They just watched. Some shook their heads. Some whispered under their breath. And some smiled. Because for the first time in years, Karen had no power. The firefighters eventually moved in, but by then, it was too late. The house was unsalvageable. And Karen? She was losing her mind. "Why didn't you come sooner?" she shrieked at the fire chief, her voice raw with rage. The chief, the same one she had humiliated 2 weeks earlier, simply tilted his head and said, "We followed HOA guidelines, ma'am, just like you wanted." Boom! The crowd erupted into gasps and laughter. Jake? He let out a slow, satisfied chuckle. Karen's face turned red. Not from the fire, but from rage and humiliation. She had trapped herself in her own rules. And everyone knew it. The next morning, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. With Karen's house nothing but a pile of ashes. She had bigger problems than running an HO, but the board had had enough. The neighborhood was furious. The media got involved. Local news stations picked up the story of how an HOA president blocked emergency services. Karen tried to defend herself. She blamed the fire department. She blamed the neighbors. She even tried to blame Jake. But no one was listening. And within 24 hours, She was removed as HOA president. Effective immediately. Karen wasn't done yet. Oh no. If she was going down, she was going down swinging. She filed a lawsuit against the fire department, claiming that they let her house burn down on purpose. It backfired. The judge laughed her out of court. The fire department pulled up security footage, showing her physically blocking them from saving Jake's house. The verdict? Case dismissed. And just like that, Karen lost everything. Her house, her power, her reputation, gone. A few weeks later, the neighborhood held a block party. For the first time in years, people could relax without Karen breathing down their necks. No one had to worry about petty fines or passive-aggressive HOA letters. And best of all, Karen was gone. She moved out of Maplewood Estates in shame, never to be seen again. Jake? He never got his house back. But he got something better. Justice. Because in the end, karma always delivers. And this time, it served up a 5-alarm fire. They say what goes around comes around. And sometimes, comes with sirens and flashing lights. Karen spent years ruling over her neighborhood like a tyrant. She controlled people's lives with petty rules and ridiculous fines. She thought she was untouchable, until she made one fatal mistake. She blocked a fire truck from saving someone else's home. And when it was her turn to beg for help, she found herself trapped by the very same rules she had created. Irony doesn't get any better than that. After Karen left, the neighborhood changed for the better. The HOA was restructured. The ridiculous rules? Gone. And the residents? Free. And Jake? He rebuilt his life. Not in Maplewood Estates, but somewhere far away, where people cared more about community than control. But if you ask him about Karen, he'll just smile and say, karma always wins. HOAs can be useful. But when power-hungry people like Karen take over, they become a nightmare. But here's the thing about power trips and petty revenge. Karma has the final say. And when it strikes, it burns everything to the ground. Do you believe in karma? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more insane HOA revenge stories. Until next time, be good, or karma might just pay you a visit. Winking face.